exist. As the proverb says, tomorrow never comes. There is no such thing as tomorrow. There never will be, because time is always now.
Welcome to the Philosophical Minds podcast, the podcast about the stuff we wonder about.
And other things.
All right, so today I am joined with a contemplative mystic and author and esoteric cartographer and amazing speaker, incredible artist, and certified madman in the best way possible, David Chaim Smith. David, I was telling you that I'm somewhat of a navigator in this space, sailing this ocean of the esoteric, and so to be able to sit and talk with you as a cartographer, I think it's going to be really beneficial and fun and exciting for myself as well as the listeners, since you have such a great, wide-reaching perspective. The way that you articulate your personal experiences and your understanding of the nature of things, it's really captivating and informative. It's almost like mathematical precision in the way that you can pinpoint and deconstruct and reconstruct perceptions. And I've been in the process of attempting to absorb some of your material, and even with my limited understanding at this point, it's been very beneficial and provided me with a lot of new considerations and ideas to contend with in regards to the dynamics of reality and the nature of things.
Well, thank you for saying those kind things. I'm very happy to talk to you, and glad to answer any kind of question that you want to give me. Just let her rip.
All right.
Don't hold back.
Okay. So my first question is, this is, the name of my podcast. It's Philosophical Minds. The idea of philosophy could mean a lot of things to different people. I kind of conceive of it as the understanding for me is philosophia as the love of wisdom, and my conception of wisdom kind of hovers around the notion of potential realizations about the true nature of reality, and you actually have a book called The Fountain of Wisdom, I believe. So I wanted to get your perspective first and foremost on how you conceive of philosophy or philosophizing, and then as well as your understanding of wisdom itself.
Okay. Very, very good question. When one enters into the inquiry about the state that we call reality, which is an open question, there are many ways in which knowing can take place. And knowing with the intellect, conceptual knowing, which underscores what we call philosophy and philosophical inquiry. That form of knowing having to do with the intellectualized apprehension of reality is just one type of knowing out of many. And it is a type of knowing that practitioners such as myself do not trust. So although it is sort of a necessary evil to describe and communicate theories and methodologies and a broad perspective in which the investigation takes place, especially in the beginning of the path, it's pretty necessary to digest a fair amount of philosophy. Mystical practitioners generally distrust the intellect because the forms of knowing that are more direct, more naked, so to speak, do not involve language, do not involve words. And beyond that, do not involve concepts. And if they do involve concepts, the concepts become more and more subtle until the point where the subtlety breaks and language can no longer be used. So the intellect, which is habitually fixated on a linguistic pattern, in other words, when you think to yourself, even philosophically think to yourself, generally it's done with words. Generally, it's a verbal associative process and a verbal analysis. So My relationship to philosophy is that it's a nice start, but I distrust it. Now, the second part of your question was about wisdom. And it's a very good way to frame the question, because wisdom, in my language, in my way of using the term, pertains to the direct apprehension of reality beyond language, beyond linguistics, beyond semiotics, beyond the reduction to intellectualized equivalent structures. You could say that pure wisdom is beyond even symbols, which symbols are far beyond words, right? Symbols are the touch point where the mind enters into the sublime, incomprehensible, translinguistic depths of a direct connection with the ultimate, that I would refer to as the divine. So in the realm of wisdom, there's only direct gnosis. But in the realm of philosophy, the best we could do is form equivalence and personal experiences, which are limited to subjective terms. And anytime you're limiting yourself to subjective levels of function, you run into a certain kind of a problem. What is subjectivity? Well, subjectivity is based off of a knowing subject. That's why it's called subjectivity, right? The subject is the knower, and the knower interacts with bits of information, objects of thought, objects of consideration. So you have this dichotomy, this dualistic dichotomy in philosophy between a knowing subject and objects which are known, and that dualism creates problems. Wisdom is the lack of that. So if that made sense, that's actually my answer to your question.
I'm trying to absorb that. Would you say in this current state of, I guess, large amounts of individuals and how their minds are working, would you say that concepts and ideas in regard to philosophizing or holding philosophical ideas can help in the resolving or unveiling of particular truths? Like you had mentioned, like getting naked reality in that sense. Do you think that it could be a stepping stone, at least in terms of leading one to Gnostic realization?
No, I don't. I think that it could start one out on the path simply by getting a person enthusiastic about the question, but I don't think that it comes near to addressing the actual question. What it does is creates the illusion that the mind can understand what its circumstance is. And in that illusion, the mind creates equivalent structures and believes in them, thinks that its own mental packaging is true, its own abstractions and associations are true. And the deeper that goes, the further the mind gets away from addressing that naked clarity, which is beyond personal experience. So no, I feel that philosophy will always backfire. Philosophy will always mislead the mind into thinking that it knows what it's doing and thinking that its speculations are correct. And this has been proven by the works of philosophers for thousands of years. None of them institute a realization in people. They might get people excited about starting the path, but it ain't the path. So practitioners always think philosophers are bullshitting, and philosophers always think that mystics are full of crap. So the two almost never come together.
Okay. I'm by no means well versed in your system or anything, but one thing I do love about it is that it's not a definitive system. It's from my understanding, it's constantly evolving, and that what a concept that is. I think that's true, that for any system to be considered an actual living and thriving system and operating in an effective way, it does need to be adaptive to phenomena itself. And so maybe could you speak to the evolutionary principle as it applies or appears to apply within the nature of reality?
Well, I'm not really sure what you mean by that, but what I do in my work with my books is I express my own practice. And since I am a practitioner and on the path, there's a difference between those who are through with the path, who are considered masters, like a Buddha or a Christ. You could say that they're not practitioners, they're expressions of the end of the path, the fruit of the path, the result of the path. Anybody who is not a Buddha or a Christ who's working a path is a practitioner. And practitioners are constantly refining what they do, restating over and over, perfecting, honing the process. So I'm expressing my own practice in process. It's a work in progress. So it's not definitive, as you said, in that sense. So I'm not writing books to give people a roadmap and say, start with volume number 1 and then go to volume number 2 and do exactly as I say, and you will get this result. I'm not handing people that kind of instruction manual. I don't know what people do with my work. I'm more just expressing what I have done. You know, I'm not seeking to be anyone's teacher or guide or instructor. I'm expressing what has happened to me over 30 years of doing this.
And from my understanding, you have quite a list of inquiry into various lineages, and so I think that's coming from a very deep and well-informed perspective. One thing I heard you draw attention to that I thought was a valid and important notion in regards to, I think you're speaking about just magic and the esoteric inquiry, was the issue of individuals being interested in manipulation of circumstance versus the interest or pursuit of gnosis or Gnostic realization. And I guess I fall a little bit in both of those categories, in the sense that I am interested in understanding the dynamics of manipulation, for example, in terms of psychology, so that I could be aware of forces or individuals attempting to manipulate me or my circumstance, or also on the level of manipulating material substances, such as in the realm of alchemy, to facilitate a purification perhaps, or produce a medicinal formulation of some kind. Can you speak to that and the idea of, or your thoughts on that in regards to Gnostic realization?
Yeah, sure. The question of the reason why one does the work that one does is based on an end game, right? Like, what is the end result that is sought in the work? And when it comes to what we call worldly practices, practices that are locked within the changing circumstances of the world, whether they be in the realm of magical processes like ceremonial magic, or certain forms of alchemy in the sense of practical alchemy, laboratory alchemy, if there is a worldly goal, which is to change a set of circumstances, modify the phenomena of circumstances to get a desired outcome in the changing world of one's perception, then that marks that type of work as bounded by circumstance. On the other hand, the contrary point of view would be using these technologies, whether they be alchemical or magical or mystical, for the end game of going beyond the changing circumstances that defines one's world and one's experience, to investigate the essential nature of reality itself, which does not change. So it's really a question of whether the goal is operating locked within a continuum that is just made of change and changing scenarios, or whether one becomes interested in changelessness per se. The changelessness that I'm referring to is very often referred to in theistic systems as the divine, or many terms are used, the absolute, the ultimate, right? If the goal is the ultimate realization of the ultimate state of freedom, the open state of pure possibility in which anything can happen, well, that would be beyond the things that change. It would be beyond the changing scenarios and circumstances that constitute somebody's worldview. That's what we call wisdom. So there's wisdom magic, wisdom alchemy, wisdom contemplation, and there is worldly magic, worldly alchemy, and worldly contemplation. And the two are really very, very quite different and set out to do different things.
Yeah, that's interesting to think about, the changing circumstantial nature of things within the unchanging, I guess.
We're good to go?
All right, we're good to go. Seems like it worked. So my next question is in regards to, I've heard you speak about hyalic matter, and I was wondering, is the hyal, from your understanding, is that generally synonymous as a symbol with what's referred to as the primordial waters of chaos, or are those different things?
The term that you're interpreting as hyalic matter in Yiddish is the word hayuli, which is a sort of bastardization of the Greek. And when I use that term, what I'm talking about is the reification of the basis of reality by the mind. And from the view that I hold, to reify reality is to make a concrete mental equivalent for the intellect to think that it understands what is happening to it, its thoughts, its feelings, its sense perceptions. All of that, if the knowing that the mind engages in is predicated on a reified state, then what is lost is the direct, open-ended interpretation, or I should say the direct impact of reality. Instead, the mind cloaks itself in equivalent structures that it has manufactured about its own experience. So the term hayuli, or hyal, if you want to take it back to its Greek root, is the term I use for the mind's mistake about reality, the error of reality. And this is the root error that all other errors are based on. All the falsifications and the fictions about the reality that the mind perceives, that it believes in, that leads it into the wrong direction, are predicated on the reification of the reality of all of it itself, and that is termed hayuli. The counterpose to this, to engage reality clearly without fabricating or falsifying equivalent structures about it, in other words, without reifying it, I refer to as avira. So the avira would be the basis of truth, and hayoli would be the basis of fiction or error. So hyalic matter would be mistaken phenomena, the mistake of phenomena, the way that I use the term.
Okay.
And in that sense, it would have no value whatsoever.
From my understanding, you conceive of Mercury as the mind, And if I was wondering if you make any differentiation between the mind and the psyche.
Yes. When I'll give you the breakdown. You see, now you're asking me about how I use these terms. And in no way am I suggesting that my usage of language is the correct one or the definitive one. I can describe to you how I use these terms, but these are just my own designations. I mean, everybody, in order to write a book or communicate, has to come up with an answer to how they're going to use the words that they use. So this is just the way that I use the terms that people will understand, right? When I use the term psyche, what I am talking about is the complex of associative activity in which the mind designates temporary or relative meanings on constructs. And those constructs move around all the time. They're constantly changing and shifting. So what the psyche does is essentially keeps track of patterns in motion. And the patterns that we're talking about here are associative patterns. The mind's associative designations of temporary meanings on a changing fluid process. That is called the ruach, the wind of the mind in Hebrew, but the term that a modern person would know would be psyche, because it's the basis of the word that everyone knows, psychology, the study of the motions of the psyche and its manner of operation. When I use the term consciousness, I'm talking about the mind as such in relation to the psyche. In other words, something is consciously apprehended, and the way that it's apprehended is in motion, the way that thinking and feeling would engage it. The big break comes when I use the term awareness. Awareness, as opposed to consciousness, is that clear, direct, unmitigated apprehension where there are no mental constructs in the way. So there is clarity, there is openness, there is brilliance, and a luminous quality that is far greater than any mental construct or enclosure could ever perceive. So awareness would be the most unadorned, pure state. Consciousness would be the basis of the fabricated state or the impure state, and the psyche would just be the mind's errors. So all of it would be, you could generalize all of it and say that it's all the mind, and that would be a correct assessment. But when I use the term mind, I get very, very specific about what is being realized. Is it awareness? Is it consciousness? And if it's consciousness, it's attributed to the meanderings of the psyche. But all of it, you could say, is mind in the Hermetic sense.
Yeah.
Like in the sense that Corpus Hermeticum uses the term mind with a capital M, we could say.
Yeah. I'm wondering, within that complex of associative activity, could you describe your conception of sulfur? Because I've come to find that within the realm of at least alchemy, specifically an operative alchemy, it's useful to conceive of sulfur as related to the psyche, because it kind of translates into a functional, cohesive framework in the lab in terms of understanding the fixed and volatile aspects of the sulfur, as well as, say, fixed and volatile aspects of the psyche.
Yep, I agree completely. Yes, the sulfur in relation to the psyche is life force, and the quality of sulfur is raised out of its normal patterns by increasing heat and applying pressure. So the type of pressure that we're talking about, for example, in contemplation, would be exploring that which the mind cannot know. In other words, probing that which is beyond the reach of the psyche's patterns. In other words, inquiring or exploring things that push the boundary of the mind into uncharted territory. That generates tremendous pressure on the mind's limitations. When that happens, you need a lot of juice, you need a lot of energy, you need a lot of fire. So the sulfur is automatically stirred up and rises when the pressure is exerted on the mind's limitations. Now, the mind's limitations themselves are referred to as salts. They're frozen, desiccated, constricted states which produce the limitations that the pressure comes up against. So there's this direct interaction in the type of alchemy that I describe between the raised force of sulfur and the frozen salts that want to constrict it. Now, once that heat and pressure of the sulfur is applied to the frozen limitations or the salt states, the thing that has been frozen in those salts starts to melt, and that's literally mercury. What happens there is that the sulfur is liberated and rises due to the application of heat and pressure. The salts begin to gradually become fluid, and once those salts are liberated into a completely fluid form, what flows from them is states of mercury, which are ultimately states of awareness.
And it seems, I think I've heard you mention mercury seems accurately to represent the dynamism of life force, and you mentioned sulfur as life force. So in that sense, would it be representing the dynamism of sulfur?
Yes. The only difference between the life force that applies the heat and the mercury that is liberated, they're ultimately the same exact thing. The only thing that's different about them is their manner of functioning. So when the heat is expressed and it builds up and life force is taken out of its very quietly limited patterns. In other words, when the mind is asked to do something that is not in its normal habituation of things that it does, it stirs up a volatility. And if you do it correctly along a certain discipline, the heat can actually be controlled and pinpointed to the frozen areas that seek to limit it. When that happens, we call just the raw fire and the pressure that directs the fire, we call that sulfur. And when the frozen limitations are melted and mercury becomes known, the mind simply engages modes of knowing that it didn't know before. We call that mercury. But I don't want to imply that the mercury and the sulfur are different things. They're not. They're aspects of the same ground. They're aspects of the same basis. The ground or the essential nature of reality both knows and is known. So where would the mercury and the sulfur be when we try to describe them? Is it the power of knowing, or is it something that the mind knows? In other words, is it the subject or the object? Well, that's really the question. That's what we're calling into question by doing this alchemical work. Ultimately, what happens at the end of the day is the fire of life force and the liberated mercury are realized to be identical to each other. And that's a fairly advanced state of the alchemical process. But way before that happens, there's a tremendous amount of fire of life force that is raised, and a tremendous amount of mercury salts that are melted, and a tremendous amount of mercury that is brought into a fluid state. And when I say a fluid state, I'm not talking about a physical liquid, obviously. The type of fluidity that I'm talking about is a psychoetheric fluidity. In other words, it's much more like a wind, but a wind that is made fluid. Now, the mercury itself, even physical mercury, defies categorization because it's both a solid and a liquid and a metal and all of these different qualities. Well, that's the reason why it's used as a symbol for the mind in the alchemical process, because it is both fluid and etheric and fiery at times and all of these things, and still retains its essential character.
Wow, okay. And then, so you had mentioned raw fire. What is the secret fire in your conception within all this?
The secret fire is an aspect of life force that becomes so subtle and delicate that you have to understand that the raising of the fire has various levels. And once you're beyond the ordinary ones that pertain to physical substances and energetic actions, the type of fire that is raised becomes more and more subtle. And past the boundaries of the mind's habit patterns, the fire becomes so incredibly subtle that it is practically identical to the space in which it blazes. Once the fire equalizes with the space in which it blazes, once they are realized to be one and the same, so we don't have fire being raised anywhere, right? Once the whole concept of contextualizing the fire has been nullified, we call that the secret fire or the secret sulfur.
Okay. And so there's this association that often gets made with the life force and the will, but I've heard you draw attention to the mistake of the will being associated with that life force. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, will is an expression of the body-mind. And when the body-mind seeks ownership of its experiences, in other words, when I conceptualize myself as a subject that knows things, and I have experiences, I can talk about my experiences, right? Because I have a body-mind fixated identity. When I seek volitionally to create some sort of change, what directs that change is called will. The will is just simply the extension of the body-mind identity. Another word for body-mind identity is ego. So there is no will without ego. They're one and the same. So when people talk about the true will or the great will beyond the personal body-mind, they lose me at that point, because I don't think that there is one. I don't believe that will has a non-egocentric application.
Okay. Something I often talk about is correspondences, and you actually answered a question for me about this when I was listening to one of your interviews the other day. You were talking about the demands of streamlined conformity of correspondences and the intentional insertion on the behalf of some mystics of setting correspondences at odds with each other, but not by accident, to a degree, because in the resolving of the conflicts is where you find the crux of the meaning, or something along those lines. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, if I'm going to teach you something, you and I have to agree on a language so that we can communicate with each other, right? Communication's impossible without defining your terms. So anytime anybody ever sought to teach anything to anyone else, they had to limit their language and their symbols so that both parties agreed on what things meant so that there could be actual communication. So if you think that this process is happening throughout all of history, all of human history, all over the world, in different cultures, in different time periods, under different conditions, of course you're going to get radically different systems each time, right? So how could they all agree with each other? It would be impossible. They're site-specific. So the approach that I take is to say that, sure, we're going to agree on certain aspects of a symbol language, but when we encounter other symbol languages, we can't really use the guideline of whether it conforms to what we know or not. We have to be able to see patterns beyond language so that we could apprehend truths that are not limited to the little symbol set that we've agreed upon. So the best way that I have found to do this, especially in Kabbalah, because the symbol systems in Kabbalah vary a lot. They vary wildly, but they overlap with each other. If I was married to any particular symbol system, I couldn't help but view other symbol systems as wrong, right? And I won't do that. So what I do is I don't take any symbolism as the truth of the matter. I see them all as relative. And I look for the basic dynamics behind the patterns. And if you digest enough different symbol systems and transcend enough different languages, at a certain point, you don't need the verbal descriptions anymore. You just see the pure patterns that run concurrently from language to language. And at a certain point, especially in an area like Kabbalah, you are able to speak multiple languages simultaneously and move from one to the other, overlap them as you will, and get, incredibly fluid with them. And that just comes from having digested many symbol languages. There are 4 basic symbol languages that I've had to master in my life, based on 4 different systems. And I'm constantly going back and forth between them.
Mm-hmm. So with these dynamics behind the patterns, would you associate that with maybe something like pure archetypes?
No, because archetypes are conceptual designations, and that comes from Jungian psychology. And Jungian psychology can't reconcile anything beyond language. It's locked in the world of the psyche. It's a collective register of the psyche. Jungian psychology gets everything wrong because it's just looking at body-mind derived patterns of habituation, and it collectivizes those. So beyond the realm of its archetypes, it can't know anything. So when I see Jungians try to reconcile alchemy, you just get a whole lot of nothing. They don't know what they're doing.
On the note of the body-mind, it's interesting in contemplating some of your work. It's got me thinking in some really cool ways. And I was having a conversation with my roommate last night about what potentially remains after bodily physical death, because we were talking about the senses, and she brought up the point that there are blind people and there's deaf people, and a lot of us now know what it's like to go without the sense of smell or taste. And so we were playing with this idea of contemplating dissolving all senses and thinking about what remains when all senses are absent. So my thought was that what remains was emotion. I don't know if you would agree or disagree, but I think it would be fun to talk about. And I'm wondering if you could speak to the aspect of emotions and maybe emotional tonalities and where emotions come into play within the grand scheme of all of this.
Well, let's go back to the first thing that you said before you started talking about the senses. You're talking about physical death, right? Mm-hmm. Physical death is predicated on physical birth, right? So when I address the essential nature of reality, which is the basis of awareness, I am talking about a ground of phenomena that was never born because there was no point of origin. We're talking about openness that is self-luminous. We're talking about the self-luminous quality of that which is insubstantial and completely open and empty, essentially. So there is no thing within the ground to ever have been born. So if you're talking about an essential nature that was never born, how can it die? So both birth and death are predicated on relative finite conceptual designations, and I reject both of them because I don't think that there was anything that was ever born, so obviously there's no such thing as death. So the only thing that seems to arise and dissolve are patterns. And if I identify my mind with the pattern of this body mind and its senses and its sense fields, which are what the senses know, you're just talking about changing phenomena. And I always bring it back to that which is beyond relative change, that which is absolute and changeless. So if I'm constantly bringing the discussion back to changelessness, the senses come and go. They go in and out like the tides. It appears that they're born, it appears that they die, but really there is something essential which is unaffected by these tides, and that's really what I'm interested in, the essential nature which is absolute and unmitigated by its circumstance.
Okay, I'm going to think about that one.
Right. So in that sense, whether you want to talk to me about emotions or any other mental perception, I would just lump that in the category of relative change and say I'm not particularly interested in it.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious your thoughts on memory. What's the nature of memory and its functionality?
Memory is just a habit pattern activity that the mind uses to make associations in order to orient itself. The mind always wants to find a point of orientation, and that is a reflexive motion. In other words, what is happening to me at any given moment? That reflexive activity, which is inherently dualistic, is always based on coordinates in time and space. So what the mind does in terms of the psyche's desire for orientation is constantly look for these reflective patterns in order to create a little story about what has happened to it. I appeared, I seem to have been born, I seem to have this identity, and then I walked out of my front door and the sun was shining, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The changing circumstances that we find ourselves in are just projections of the mental patterns that try to reduce infinity into finite terms. The basis of the mind's patterns are what's called memory. When the mind has found a mode of habituation in order to make a pattern out of everything, the body of patterns that is used to do this is called mind's memory. So it's basically just the game that the mind plays to fabricate a reality that it can think that it would trust. And it's always wrong. Everything that is a projection of the mind's habit patterns is a fiction. So memory is unreliable.
Can you speak to and elaborate a little bit more on the notion of uninterrupted luminous expression?
Uninterrupted luminosity or uninterrupted luminous expression is the natural behavior of the ground of phenomena. The ground of phenomena is essentially nothingness. It is totally open. It's a set of possibilities that are endless without reducing that set of possibilities to any group of possibilities or any things that become possible. Just the state of open possibility is the essence of the ground. But its nature expresses the fullness of that possibility in a radiant, brilliant manner. That brilliance or that luminosity never departs from the open fullness of pure possibility. And that's what is referred to as luminosity. The reason why it's uninterrupted is because it doesn't reduce itself to any particular thing. And this underscores all phenomena. No matter what you mention, whether it's a mode of knowing or a thing that becomes known, the essential nature of that state is this open continuum of uninterrupted luminosity. This is what I refer to as the ground. This is also the nature of your own awareness. But of course, if we're talking about it in that sense, it isn't your awareness anymore because there's really no you.
And in terms of the ground and coming into contact with that, or coming into contact with that state of uninterrupted luminous expression, is that something that occurs spontaneously or randomly within any individual's consciousness nodal reality, or is it something that's like a predictable pattern of emergence? Like
That's a really good question. Let's start from the very beginning. This continuum of open luminosity that I'm talking about is always the case. If you make a fiction out of it by trying to reduce the circumstances of the mind into discrete packages, being a little like this or being a little like that, you could hide from what is always already the case and miss it completely. And you would think you're just an isolated body-mind in a random universe with no cohesive factors at all. And unity is completely beyond your grasp, right? The ordinary state. If you're in the ordinary state, you miss this continuum. But it doesn't mean that the continuum is not there. It just means you're oblivious to it. The goal of alchemy, the goal of mystical work or all spiritual work is realization of what is always already the case, which is exactly what we're talking about. It's always already the case, even in the worst conditions, the most ignorant, mistaken fictions that the mind produces. The essential ground of phenomena is always purely open and radiant at the same time.
Wow. I love thinking about that notion of what's always already the case.
Yeah, it's always already the case. It had no beginning, so it has no end.
Okay.
And the word for this in Kabbalah is Or En Sof, the light of En Sof. En is no, Sof is limit. So it's essentially the light of the infinite.
I want to touch on black ether. I've heard you describe this concept, and I really loved it. So I was thinking it'd be cool if you could elaborate on this idea of black ether and what that is.
Anytime the mind perceives a construct, right, whether it be something from your senses or a thought in your psyche, or a location in space or a point in time, no matter what the mind thinks it's considering, the psyche forms a mental package, right? A little mental package called a perception. And each perception is limited by what the mind thinks that it is. Right now, you think that you are somewhere doing something, right? That's just a connection of little mental packages that you've strung together to orient yourself. Each of these mental packages has a shell around it, which actually enforces its state of limitation. In other words, for a thing to be itself and not to be anything else, it has to have a shell that defines its contents. Let's take an emotion, for example. You feel a certain way. If you grasp at that feeling and seek to know it, you've created like a little bubble. It could change. It becomes slightly different the next moment, but still, it is a sealed package of information. Every mental package that has a limiting shell around it has a breaking point. And that breaking point where the package can be broken open from a finite state back into infinity, that point is called black ether. Black ether is the breakage point, not only between every mental package, but between entire networks and dimensions of mental packages. And there is an infinite interconnectivity between the mental packages that you hold as true and the realm in which you live. For example, if you look at the sky and you say the sky is blue, you can form in your own mind a mental ideation of a color and a texture and a meaning that all conform to the expanse of all the variations of the blue sky as you see it, right? That's very subjective. Your blue sky is uniquely yours because of the way that your mind is unique. But if I look at the sky, or my mother looks at the sky, We'll see it in a slightly different way. However, there's going to be some overlap between the unique ways that we see it and the unique way that you see it. The place where all the unique interpretations overlap is called the general aspect of the realm. In our case, the realm that we live is the human realm. So if you say, the sky is blue, there is a general point where that perception will overlap with all other human beings in this realm. All other human beings will look at the sky and say, yes, you're right, the sky is blue, I agree with you. But that doesn't mean that their blue sky is your blue sky. So there's this tremendous difference between the general level of phenomena and the specific or individual level of phenomena. What the black ether does is it cuts through both general and specific. And it's like a hall of mirrors. If black ether is discovered, entire associative networks that run from specific phenomena into general phenomena can run endlessly throughout variations of mental constructs. And huge, vast fields of constructions and associative networks can be opened. Ultimately, when black ether erases the mechanism that produces mercury salts, we have the state called gnosis, in which there are no general or specific individual limiting factors, and the mind lives in its essential nature. That's called gnosis, when shells are not made anymore to limit anything. You still there?
Oops, sorry about that. I had it muted. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Would you say that the methodology of contemplative mysticism puts you into contact with that breakage point or black ether?
Yes. That's all that it does. All that contemplative mysticism does is seeks the black ether within associative constructs and acts upon it. And in order to act upon it, we have exactly what I mentioned before, a drawing forth of a rising sulfur, a melting of a series of limiting salts to make fluid or liberate the frozen mercury of those reductions and limitations, so that mercury can essentially realize its own ground, its own basis. And enormous amounts of mercury has to be liberated before that can happen.
And within this understanding, do you think that our consciousness returns to the ground, like the idea that we are drowning in the bath of the divine, only to be dissolved into the ever-present origin of eternity? Do you think the ocean of eternity just absorbs and re-emerges individuated, like reality bubbles of temporary becomings? Or is it a refinement type process where the originating becomings of individuated mind gets purified and transmuted into its own new state? And, like once it's in its new state, is that just something that gets recapitulated eternally? Or you know what I mean?
I do know what you mean, and I think it's actually a really good question. The difference between all those models that you just referred to was just a simple shift in meaning. To make a long story short, to say it in a really easy way, all we're doing in the alchemical process is shifting meaning from a more reductive or limited state to a more open, vaster state. And what we're doing is just shifting the meaning between the reduced, very small, very tight, very claustrophobic sense of reality that we think is true from the perspective of the body-mind into increasingly vaster horizons that imply more and more openness and radiance. And ultimately, the world phenomena itself becomes translucent and transparent as a result of this activity. The more the meaning of reality opens up, the freer we are and the less claustrophobic we are. So what I understood about your question was really how meaning shifts in order to open. And that's really what this work is all about. It's about the inquiry into freedom, into the free state.
Yeah, it makes me think, kind of like makes me have the idea of reality bubbles just being saturated in the essence of that boundless freedom, yet destined to pop and reform. And if that's the case, it's kind of like an inevitable cycle of conceptual constructs arising and then being subsumed by themselves, like a blinking in and out of existence in terms of existence as we can conceive of it generally. I don't know.
Well, think about those bubbles, right? Think about the bubbles themselves. Where are they? What's holding them?
Yeah.
What's around them? We know what the bubbles are. The bubbles are our own designations of meaning onto specific things, right? We know that moments in time and locations in space and sense perceptions and ideas and feelings, that these are all the bubbles that you're talking about. But where are they? What's holding them? That's really the question. What surrounds them? We know what's inside of them. The mind is trapped in its own designations. But what's beyond that? What's outside of the skin of each bubble? That's really what I'm interested in, because that's what's actually free. It's free of being contained. It's uncontainable.
Yeah, and you often speak about the infinite nature of things, which I see truth in infinity as in the sense of the ever-present eternality of what is. But within the all, my question is there a finite amount of divinity that is infinitely operational, or is infinity infinitely expansive?
There couldn't be a finite degree of anything essential, because there is literally no thing there in divinity. There is no thing. There is no quality or characteristic or substance that turns it into or reduces it to a definable terms. It's absolutely open. It's just pure open fullness of pure possibility. The infinite is just simply open and possible. When things appear to be finite and limited, they're reduced by virtue of conceptual designations to be locked into specific roles. The essence is just purely open. So if you're interested in that openness, ultimately what happens as this path pursues is that you discover it within everything. Once the black ether opens up the little containers, the bubbles of the mind's designations, it doesn't stop the world from appearing in all its variation. It just shifts the meaning of the world back to the infinite, because the infinite is in the business of presenting itself as if it was finite.
Wow.
And even though the infinite does this trick of presenting itself as if it were finite, it doesn't mean that it's true. So it's a matter of whether we're going to take the world at face value and see it just as a bunch of random finite things, or whether we're going to look deeper and say, well, the finite things aren't going away, but we were wrong about their meaning. They're actually open. They're actually infinite and not finite at all. It doesn't make them go away. It changes their meaning.
Yeah, wow, okay. I've noticed in my reality that the subject of infinitum, it can literally sometimes induce like an anxiety response in some people. I'm curious if you've had this, if you've witnessed this, and what your thoughts are about why some people have this response.
Well, there's different levels of the kind of anxiety reaction and panic reaction that I think that you're talking about. And there's the normal one, which is normal existential dread and normal existential panic about the claustrophobic feeling of being an isolated little dust speck of a person in this huge universe. But there are other aspects of anxiety that happen as the path becomes more and more intense. And there are certain phases of mysticism, there are certain phases of the path where tremendous amounts of life force is raised, which gets very hot. Remember, it's a fire. And all the points of orientation start to melt. There are certain phases of this process where one loses one's bearings, and it gets very confusing, and that's when a type of anxiety sets in that's really, really rough, and it's painful. It's extremely painful. What happens with advanced practitioners is very often their work calls for them to go into retreat. Could be a week, it could be a month, it could be a year, it could be 3 years. And what's good about retreats is that you shut out every kind of competing factor for your mind to fixate on and just simply concentrate on your practice. And what happens in these super concentrated, intense retreat periods is that you confront this very, very painful energy of anxiety where the mind loses its bearings and essentially gets lost. And part of what's good about doing these types of retreats is that you set up a safe place. Because, if you were out in the world, you get into a lot of trouble if you were, psychologically coming apart like that.
Yeah.
So retreats are very good if they're done properly, but if they're done improperly, you could do massive permanent damage to the mind.
Yeah, can you maybe elaborate a little bit on the potentials of how that would occur?
Well, it ends up in mental illness. I mean, if you do it incorrectly, you could end up with a form of psychosis.
I think there was something I heard you talking about a Sufi tradition and the common production of, was it called musks or something like that?
Yeah, the term must refers to an individual that becomes what we call divinely intoxicated, and some of these cases can appear dysfunctional from the outside, meaning that what happens to the practitioner could be stable realization, but it could also be partial realization. In any case, the person's capacity to communicate again in the general phenomena of the human realm can go away completely, and they can appear like they're psychotic. But they're not. There's a difference between somebody who is psychologically impaired and a must. A must is somebody who's in a Gnostic state that simply has no more need to communicate with other human beings. But the other human beings don't know that. So they would see this person as whatever level of psychosis would be apprehended, possibly catatonic. Sometimes people think that they have dementia, but they don't. They just have erased the parts of the associative process that they don't need anymore. And sometimes it's very hard to tell. That's all I could say. I mean, I cannot tell you if a person is a true must or whether they're mentally ill. I can't tell the difference.
Yeah. Well, we're on that subject of, I brought up like the Sufi traditions, and I don't really know a whole lot about them, to be honest, but there was something I had listened to you where you were discussing different traditions, and you were also talking about the Tibetan lineages, and you got into describing the predecessor to that, and as a lot of people are under the impression that some of those lineages originated within Tibet and those Tibetan traditions, but they actually came from other areas. I was wondering if you could kind of describe a little bit about the movement of ancient Gnostic traditions and kind of some of the history with that.
Not too well, because I'm not a scholar and I'm not a historian, so I can't really speak with any kind of authority on the timeline. But I know that certain aspects of my own training extended from forms of tantric alchemy that began in a place called Odiana, which is not a place that's on the map anymore. It's in the territory between what is now Afghanistan and what is now called Pakistan. And it extended from there into northern Iran and a number of other places. Some people say that Odiana was actually in Bengal, although I don't believe that that's true. I think it was nearer to Afghanistan. And it moved from there after the 8th century eastward to Tibet. And what they call Vajrayana in Tibet, or Tibetan Buddhism, is an outgrowth of this. It comes from another place. So it really has very little to do with Tibet. It was an import into Tibet. But in addition to moving eastward, it also moved in other directions. Like I said, went into Iran, which was called Persia back then. Or no, this is pre-Persian, actually. And the thing about that is that it moved into these areas and influenced what became other systems. So you see it in other systems. You see it in the Advaitic system. You see it in Hindu Tantra, in the Nath lineage in particular. You see it in Sufism. You see it in Jewish Kabbalah as well, because there were Jews in Afghanistan 1,000 years ago. So they got the influence ultimately of this migration. You also see it to a certain extent in the form of Tantra that Sikhs practice as well, which was quite a bit later.
Yeah. So is this lineage sort of transmission associated with that text, the Fountain of Wisdom, the original Aramaic one?
The Fountain of Wisdom is from the 13th century from Southern Europe. And I don't know how these guys got what they got in southern France and in Spain. But my feeling is that what entered into that current ultimately does come from the area that we're talking about, because the view is the same. So I have no historical or scholarly way to prove it, but I can't see any other way that a view like this would end up in Southern Europe at a time when the dominant views were really quite different.
Yeah. Maybe you could touch on that particular Fountain of Wisdom text and give a little bit of insight into it, because I've heard you speak a little bit about it before, and it's pretty interesting in the sense that it doesn't necessarily follow a linear narrative.
See, the thing is, in Kabbalah, generally, you have a roadmap. You have the roadmap of the Tree of Life and the 10 Sefirot, and then the worlds and the parts of the soul. It's like anybody who knows anything about Kabbalah will refer to that kind of map making in order to understand the system. The Fountain of Wisdom is one of the only texts that doesn't have any of the Kabbalistic elements that people know in its manner of describing what it wants to communicate. It's communicating with a language that is so utterly different than anything else that it's really in a class by itself. And that language is based on psychoetheric texturing. Really, it's a book of textures. And the types of textures that we're talking about are textures of knowingness that can't be reduced to either a subject that knows things or objects which are known. Just the knowingness itself is this essentiality that we call the ground, like we said before. But it's the ground presenting itself as a series of exploratory textures. And these textures have a great variety of manners of expression. They can appear subtle or gross, solid or fluid, hot or cold, according to how change is being portrayed and the types of change that the text actually is communicating to us is the type of change of transmutation, meaning how textures arise on the path as the path is working. And the goal of the path is always this great freedom and openness of the infinite. However, we find ourselves in these finite circumstances. So as the finite circumstances start to dissolve, which is really what the path does, it dissolves this idea of solidity and reduction. As this dissolution occurs, endless fields of texture are released. And what the Fountain of Wisdom does is really give us little snapshots of these dissolving fields of texturizing that are boundless. It's like one after another. The minute that you have a fix on what you think is one state, it turns into something else, right? And the way that the text describes these changing fields is with purely mental language, like talking about how phenomena coalesces into form and remains semi-solid at the same time. So that's why I use the term psycho-etheric. It's like the mind's own formless language of association. But the text never gives us concrete designated forms. So the entire text lives in this twilight state.
So with this variety of psycho-etheric fields or textures, do you see it kind of like a palette that you have access to and can paint with in terms of having these different etheric textures that you can utilize in the continuous open freedom that we exist in?
What a good comment. I got to congratulate you on that comment, because what you just said, that palette that you're talking about, I've based my entire life on that palette, because this is the central text of all of my work. All of the drawings, all of the writings, all the stuff I've done is based on this palette that you're talking about. So yes, it's based on this palette for sure. And this is what I go to when I derive the unique symbology of my own work. I go to that text. You know, the Fountain of Wisdom is almost unheard of by anybody. Very few people know about it because there was only one English translation, and it's a very short text, and almost nobody saw it. So when I sought to do a commentary on it, I went to the one translator who did it years before we actually put out the book. And I approached this guy who's a scholar, and I told him who I was. He thought I was nuts because, you know, nobody does this anymore. And gradually over time, we agreed to work together. So he made a new translation other than the one that was put out in the late 80s for me. He redid it for the book that I did and gave it to me. And I used that and wrote commentary on it and put out the Fountain of Wisdom in its complete form with the actual text without commentary in the back of the book. And the guy's name was Alan Brill, Professor Alan Brill. He's also an Orthodox rabbi. And, you know, he's credited with the translation. I just wrote the commentary. And it's the only one that exists in English.
Thank you for doing that.
Well, you're welcome. See, the thing of it is that in the Hasidic world, they had the Fountain of Wisdom text for hundreds of years. But it's so short, it was placed in compilations of early Kabbalistic short texts, mostly attributed to things that related to the tradition of the Baal Shem Tov, who was the founder of the Hasidic movement. So if you go into the house of an educated Hasidic person in Brooklyn and you say, what do you think of the Fountain of Wisdom? They'll say, I don't know what you're talking about. And then you say, okay, go to your shelf, take out this book of short texts attributed to the Baal Shem Tov and the Maggid of Mezerich, and look in the table of contents And they'll say, wow, I never saw that before. I've had that my whole life. I never even looked at it. Yeah, you never even looked at it, and neither did any of your friends, neither did any of your teachers, neither did anybody in your community.
That's fascinating.
But it was there the whole time. As a matter of fact, in Hebrew, there's tons of books with this in it. But nobody ever did anything with it. So about 20 years ago, I found it. And it took me a really long time to reconcile because the first time I saw it, it made absolutely no sense. I mean, I struggled with it for many years before it started to communicate to me.
Yeah, and you have quite a few books. Additionally, I'm wondering what are a couple that you feel are some of your personal productions that you would like to throw out there if you were to say they're ones that you're proud of how they turned out and you feel like they're some of your best work. What would be a couple of the books that you've done so far?
Well, it's getting into late February of 2022, and next week I get delivery of the 6th volume of my Lightning Flash of Olive series called Black Ether. That's the title of the book. And of course, every creative person thinks the best thing they ever did is the thing that they just did.
Yeah.
So I would say that my mind is in that book, so I think Black Ether's the best, obviously, because that's what I've committed myself to putting in print. So in my mind, that's the best thing I've ever done. There were a couple of books I could tell you that I think were less good. I did a book called The Awakening Ground that was very much rushed by the publisher that I don't think turned out well. So anybody who hears this interview, don't get The Awakening Ground. Get something else.
Yeah. One thing I really love is, because I'm someone who, I'm sort of an artist myself, and I am always drawn to different diagrams and whatnot. So I've often researched various old diagrams of different cosmological views or ways of conceptualizing reality. And my thought had always been, where are the modern people reproducing and updating some of these? And then I had came across yours, and they're so informative and deep. There was, I don't remember what book it was exactly, but there's one that I came across that I was looking at yesterday where you had different, it was like a breakdown, an artistic diagram of, you have like, say, space, light, energy, context in these 4 sections off to the side, and how these 7 levels of how they're all connected, from the investigation aspect to the comprehension to the textures of feeling and so on. It's hard to describe in words for people that are listening, but these diagrams that you create, for me as someone who is a kind of a visual learner, they're absolutely beautiful and incredible and deep. So I wanted to just throw that out there for anybody who might be listening to check those out too.
Well, thank you very much. The one thing that I could say about that is that this way of working, making the types of diagrams that you're describing, is a practice that one engages in. Just like you could engage the practice of physical alchemy or engage the process of meditative contemplation in a more formal sense, like a quietist sense, there are many, many practices, methodologies that people use. So making these types of diagrams is a type of mystical practice, which makes it very different than the general concept of making a work of art. So I don't view these diagrams as works of art in the conventional sense at all. I just see them as a part of my practice. That's very different, because a work of art, certainly in the contemporary sense, is a very specific thing and belongs in a specific place in people's minds. Works of art have a meaning, right? It's like if you take, have you ever heard of a painter called Barnett Newman?
I have not, no.
Okay, I'll give you another example. Well, Barnett Newman's good. I could describe it to you pretty easy. A typical Barnett Newman painting would be a field of one color with like one stripe on it. So a big red rectangle, maybe it's got a green stripe on it. If you take this painting and you hang it in the Museum of Modern Art, you would look at it as a work of art in an art context, and everybody would recognize it's some sort of cultural artifact or whatever. You take the same painting and you put it in a random parking lot. When people get out of their car and see it, they're not going to think this is a work of art. They're going to think this is a tabletop. They're going to think this is, a piece of garbage that fell off of something. They're going to think maybe somebody dropped their awning from the front of their store, And would anybody think that is important or beautiful or worthy of consideration? Are they going to stand there in the parking lot and look at the big red rectangle with the green stripe on it and go, oh, wow, my whole life has changed because I saw this in the parking lot? No. So the context of what makes something a work of art in a contemporary sense is so locked into its context that you got to question the whole meaning of what it is to make a work of art and call it a work of art, right? When that's really considered in the cultural sense, you have a set of associations that when you really think of them in relation to what I'm doing, they don't connect to what I'm doing at all. I mean, what I do, if I tell you it is a spiritual practice that I engage in, and it ends up with these artifacts, these diagrams, that is a decent explanation for how those diagrams got there. If I tried to pass them off as works of art, I'd sure have some explaining to do. And it wouldn't make any sense to anybody.
Yeah.
So I always opt for saying that it's not art. It has nothing to do with art. And I don't even want to talk with art people about it. And the reason I'm saying that is because I was an artist in galleries for years. And I know that world, and this is something else.
Yeah, that actually lends a lot of important insight. I want to ask you a couple more questions, kind of like on a different note, but I am curious. So you are married, and I was hoping you could speak on marriage and love itself and the value that you find in marriage. What does a healthy marriage look like in your estimation? And what's your conception of love? I know that like the Greeks, they have maybe like 5 different ways of describing love. So I'm wondering from you what that means to you.
Another good question. Remember before when we were talking about the essence as being totally open, and the essence of reality is just open, pure possibility that shines out its fullness, and we call that fullness luminosity. And the openness and the luminosity are really the same thing. You remember that? We just said that.
Yeah.
Well, that shining, radiant, open fullness is also called love. But it's not love of anything from anyone. It's love in itself, in and of itself, without a subject or without an object. You ever hear a Christian say God is love? Well, this is what they mean. This is exactly what they mean. The essential nature of reality is loving. It's essentially good. It's essentially bright and full of possibility. And this is very hard for people to understand, because how do you apply that to the horrors of the world? Well, this is the job of mysticism. Mysticism cuts through what we like and what we don't like, what we think is great and what we think is awful, and tries to find within it that essential goodness, which is not good just because we like it, right? Like this goodness lives in the stockyards, in the slaughterhouse, in the concentration camp, in the prison. It's the discarded remnant and refuse of the detritus of reality. Either it's everywhere or it's nothing at all. So this ubiquitous, shining brilliance called reality is literally love. So I can't think of my marriage or any other expression of love as anything other than that. It's proof of the divine, period. As far as saying anything else about marriage is concerned, I'm the wrong person to talk to because I'm barely even here. But that's what I could say, that the essential nature of love is the heart of the divine.
Yeah. I love that. Well, let's see. Are there any last messages that you'd like to put out there for people? Just anything that comes to mind before you kind of tell people where they can find your work?
Well, I don't know what to say to people in general. I mean, if people are interested in my work, they are probably already so far away from the mainstream of society that they're probably not listening to almost anybody. If they're investigating me, they're probably way, way, way on the fringe. And if I could talk to people on the fringe, the only thing I would say to them is keep going. That mainstream society is a trap and you don't need it. It's better to dump it. It's better to opt out of it and to get rid of it. It doesn't do anything good, as far as I'm concerned. I am a hermit practitioner. So, obviously that's my point of view. Obviously, I don't think that I even want to be part of a culture. The way I don't live in a culture. I have nothing to do with the culture. Like everything I said about art before applies to everything else. If you do this work, you seal yourself off. You're in the desert. You've waved goodbye to Rome.
Yeah.
I forgot what the second part of your question was.
The second part, I was just asking you if you had any last messages, and then I would, of course, want you to be able to put out where people can find out more about you and your work, and maybe you can, direct people where they can find your work.
I'm married to a wonderful woman who runs everything for me. She keeps me in retreat. She does everything that needs to be done, which includes like all the business for the books and whatnot. So my wife Rachel, she runs a website where you can buy the books. I mean, you could also buy them from Amazon or places like that, but you could get them directly from my website. And my wife is really good about packaging and shipping. And if you just Google my name, David Chaim Smith, and you see my website, my wife will answer any questions you have, and you could buy my stuff with PayPal, and she'll ship it right to you. It's very effective. It's amazing to me that it works as well as it does. We almost never have books misplaced or damaged or going lost, and we're shipping books out every day, and people get them. It's amazing to me. And different parts of the world too. I just sent a book the other day to Swaziland in Africa. It's like who in this remote part of Africa is reading my book? I mean, I don't understand it.
That's really cool. Well, man, this has been excellent. It's probably one of my favorite conversations so far, and I really enjoyed it. So just want to express again my gratitude and appreciation for you taking the time today to talk to me. So
sure, you're asking me questions about the only thing that I care about. So of course I'm going to talk to you and enjoy it, because you're asking me about the one thing that I care about.
Indeed. Well, thank you, and enjoy the rest of your day. And, appreciate it, and I'll be in contact.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.